Talk faith, talk pain, talk pride, talk father, talk sons by our side. Every story that they said was weak, you gon' hear us talk on. Black men speak, turn it up, let the truth run deep. Say it, from the barbershop chair to the back row seat. If you feel how we feel, then repeat. Black men speak. Black men speak.
There's some people whose names make history books, whose faces appear on television, whose accomplishments are celebrated around the world. And then there are those whose names may never be widely known, but whose love, sacrifice, and quiet perseverance change generation. Today's guest reminds us that history isn't only made by presidents, activists, or celebrities. Sometimes history is made by a grandmother who faithfully writes letters to her grandson. A woman who, with an 8th grade education, who understood something that many of us overlook, that words of encouragement, consistency, and unconditional love can shape a life just as powerfully as wealth or fame. Welcome to Black Men Speak, the podcast whose ordinary Black men share extraordinary stories that educate, inspire, and challenge us to think differently about leadership, family, purpose, and legacy. I am your host, Keith Dent. Today, we honor to welcome author Walter Pryor, whose memoir, This Leaves Me Okay, Race, Legacy, and Letters from My Grandmother. It's far more than a family history. It's a journey through the American story. One told through the eyes of a Black family that endured poverty, racism, loss, faith, perseverance, and hope. Walter takes us from the rural South of the early 20th century to the opportunities and challenges of today, showing us how each generation builds a bridge for the next. At the heart of this story is his grandmother, Lucille, whose handwritten letters became an enduring reminder that love isn't always expressed through grand gestures. Sometimes it's found in simple words, written on paper, faithfully mailed week after week, year after year. So whether you're thinking about your parents, your grandparents, your children, or the legacy you're building right now, I hope this conversation inspires you to reflect on the shoulders you're standing on and the foundation you're creating for those who will come after you. This is a conversation about remembrance. It's about gratitude. It's about resilience. And ultimately, it's about hope. So can't wait to get into it. But first, I'm just going to give you a little bit about our author, Walter Pryor. Walter is a product of the South, the Black church, and a strong family unit of resilient, formidable women. He is a cum laude graduate of Hendrix College, the only Black student in the college's history to have been awarded the President's Medal. And he's also a graduate of Georgetown University Law Center. Pryor's professional career has spanned a myriad of sectors in the legal arena, including large and small firms. The U.S. Department of Justice, Capitol Hill, corporations, higher education, and mission-driven bank, Southern Bank Corp. So I can't wait to really get into our topic today. Let me just bring them up. Walter, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Keith. I'm really honored to be here with you.
I'm glad you're really here. I really appreciate it. So let's just get into it. So the title of your book is deeply moving, and even the cover is just is fantastic. What does the phrase "this leaves me okay" represent in your life and in your family story?
So it's interesting that we start there, because as I was writing the book, I chose "This Leaves Me Okay" because it's a line that my grandmother used to write in her letters to me. And I wasn't sure that was going to be the title, but that was my working title. And I figured I'd give it a different title once I finished it. And the true title, I guess, came to me. And as I, studied my grandmother's life, as I learned more about her and almost shared experiences with her by recounting them, I came to realize that This Leaves Me Okay served a lot of different functions. So, for example, she would always write that in her letters. And there were times where I would imagine that she was encouraging herself, and she might not have necessarily been okay, but it was like a mantra. I think there were times where it may have been a prayer that I would be okay, even if I might not be okay. I think there are times it functioned as almost a statement of resistance, and just to acknowledge for herself that in spite of everything else that's going on, she was fine and she would be okay. So I think the phrase itself can serve any number of purposes, but it was just one was an interesting kind of line for someone who isn't very well educated, who only has an eighth grade education, would choose to include that in her letters. And so it came to mean a lot to me, and I appreciate the fact that you find it moving, because it certainly carried a lot of weight for me in her letters over the years.
Yes. Okay. Absolutely. And so one thing that I found greatly impactful is that, your grandmother had only an eighth grade education, yet she faithfully wrote letters for decades. So what do you feel the letters teaches us or taught you about love, connection, and legacy?
So, first of all, I have to acknowledge that it's unusual, right? That a Black woman born in 1915, Jim Crow South, Arkansas, made most of her working life, would take up the habit of writing letters. I mean, it's not like there was something encouraging her to do it, and it's not like her education would have promoted that. And so I don't know where this idea came from. I'm not sure if she saw someone doing it, knew of people writing letters, or just in her own way recognized her agency as being something that she could control, but she decided to do it. And I believe she did it really as a way of staying connected, a way of demonstrating love. She had experienced a lot of trauma as a child. She lost her mother very young. She was sent to live with relatives who took advantage of her emotionally, sometimes physically, I would presume. And yet she recognized the value of family. It became extremely important to her. And I think she saw this as a way of knitting people together, of keeping people in touch, of demonstrating her own love for them. And so her writing, for me, it was one of the earliest experiences that I can remember in my life. I mean, I write in the book that I have very few memories beyond those where my mother is starting to read a letter to me before I can even read. But my mother is reading a letter that my grandmother has sent. And, it seems like a very small thing to get a letter in some respects. But as a kid, for me, I thought that's a huge thing. To get a letter in the mail, it was very important, and it meant that I mattered. And then for her to do this over so many years consistently, almost weekly, it demonstrates a real commitment on her part.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. How often did you receive them? So weekly, almost weekly, you received a letter, and that does take tremendous commitment, because back in the day, I mean, in order to write a letter, you actually had to think about what you wanted to put on paper. You couldn't, not that you couldn't erase or scratch out, but in the book, the letters seem very authentic. So there wasn't scratch out or anything like that in there. So what says to me is that she really was very thoughtful and meticulous about what she put on the page.
Well, it's interesting. I think you're right, but I think she wasn't necessarily trying to capture a particular, piece of advice or a lesson necessarily, because I don't think she ever really gave me that much advice. Usually her letters were a capture of what just happened to her recently, or what she happened to be doing, or what crossed her mind. And I don't think it was so much the message of the letter as it was the act of writing the letter and sending it and having that person receive it. But to your point around weekly letters, my grandmother wrote me, but she also wrote my sister. She wrote my mother. She wrote other members of our family.
Oh, okay.
And I sat down with my wife and we tried to conservatively estimate, we didn't, expect her to, or we didn't count every week as a letter. And we assumed maybe she started writing me maybe when I was 4 or 5, but up until really 2 months before she died, she was writing letters. And our conservative estimate was that she had written me over 1,000 letters. Now, unfortunately, as a kid, I didn't have the presence of mind to save those letters. But when I was in law school and she was writing me, I would stick them in my desk drawer in my apartment and not consciously saving them, but not wanting to throw them away. So by the time I graduated, I probably had 3 or 4 dozen of her letters. So when you have that, it becomes something that it feels like something substantial, something you don't want to definitely not throw away.
Wow. And so, and I didn't think of it, but since we did talk about letters, I wanted to ask this question, which I hadn't thought about before. Did she? I would assume you've talked to her on the phone, and so
yes.
Usually, when people are letter writers, they may not be as talkative when you're on the phone. But did she have the same kind of demeanor when you talked to her on the phone or face to face, or was she more reserved?
No, I think her personality was very engaging, right?
Okay.
Part of what drove me to write the book is that my grandmother had this really warm, engaging, infectious personality. And if you didn't know better, you would think she had grown up in a garden and never had a problem in her life. And the fact of the matter is she'd experienced a lot of trauma. And so part of what drove me to write the book is that I couldn't understand how someone who had gone through all the things that she had gone through could end up being the person that I knew and loved and respected so greatly, and not be traumatized and not be scarred, or at least not have visible signs of that in terms of how she acted towards people. And so that drove me to want to delve more into her life and to write the book. But in terms of how she interacted with us, it was the same in her letters. I mean, I think you can feel a kind of lightness in her letters and in the tone of her letters. That was true in person and true when you spoke to her on the phone.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And so you did talk a lot about trauma. So as you were, I guess, researching the book, of course, that was there. So was there anything that was surprising to you about the trauma that she actually went through as you were researching?
I don't know if it was surprising. I would say that it was after she died that I learned about the early traumas in her life. And that was part of the motivation for writing the book. I had not known some of those things, specifically that her mother had died when she was 4 years old and her little sister was 2. And that they had been sent to live with relatives who, didn't treat them very well. And that, of course, made me really curious. But I think maybe what was surprising, if anything, is my ability to extend grace to her, to my mother, to other relatives in the same way that I extended to myself. When you make a mistake, you can always justify it, right? You can explain why you did it. And of course, you want everybody to understand. And we're sometimes not as generous in considering other people making mistakes or making certain decisions that you don't necessarily agree with. It may not necessarily be a mistake. But I think the process of really trying to appreciate what she experienced, putting that in context in the time where she lived, the resources available to her, it gave me an ability to be less, I guess, harsh in my judgment of her.
Okay.
And to also, as I said, extend grace to her and my mother and the decisions that they made at the time that they did.
Right. Okay. And was your mom aware of the trauma that she'd experienced? And if not, how, upon learning from your research, how did that change her?
So my mother was aware. And,
Okay.
and my mother, I believe, was in college at the point that she learned about my grandmother's early trauma in terms of losing her mother and how she was treated by family. And the opening scene in the book is the story that a relative told my mother when she was in college around how my grandmother was treated. It's a scene of her being left in the yard with dogs running along the fence as a form of entertainment. And so I don't know why that had never come up before in our conversations about my
Mm,
grandmother, but
mhm.
at some point after she died, my mother told me this. And as I said, I couldn't reconcile it that she had endured that to be the person that she was. But I don't know that there were really any surprises so much as it highlighted for me the importance of having conversations with family, not taking for granted that people understand and know the stories, and also recognizing and acknowledging the contributions that those stories and experiences make to an overall family trajectory.
Gotcha. Um, absolutely. So, writing, I guess, a memoir like this requires, I guess, some vulnerability in order to be deeply ingrained in the story. So, was there a chapter or a story that you found that really touched you deeply and made it kind of emotional to kind of write and share?
Sure. Well, there are two parts of that, and I'm gonna address the vulnerability part. Then I'll talk to you about the chapter. It's really interesting because I've had people say to me, "I feel like I understand you so much better." And from my perspective, I go, "Really? Why?" Because as I was writing, I did not feel necessarily that I was being especially revealing or that I was being particularly vulnerable. And I think it would, I don't know if that's, some kind of protection feature or something you do to be able to continue
Mm,
writing, but I did not consider myself being all that exposed. And I suspect had I known, I might have, been a bit more guarded about what I said. But I felt like I was more telling my grandmother's story than my
mhm.
own, right? And so I didn't feel like I was being vulnerable necessarily. Although I realized in hindsight that I probably was, and I tell a lot of, I don't know if you want to call them family secrets, but family dynamics that I guess people don't generally talk about. But it wasn't until I was done that I realized, okay, I guess some of these things might be embarrassing to people or compromising to some degree. And thankfully, my family was supportive, my mother was supportive, and so we didn't have the issues of trying to decide, do I keep it or do I not? So to whatever degree I was vulnerable, it wasn't because I started out trying to do so or I was being particularly courageous and said, okay, I'm just going to be vulnerable anyway. I just happened upon it. Um, in relation to your question about the chapter, the one chapter stands out for me significantly, and it was a very emotional chapter, but not because it was hard to write, but because it felt like as I was writing this, my grandmother was sitting next to me and it was just flowing through me. Like I wrote the book in a workshop, and the way a workshop
Mm,
when you write a book works is you'll do 10 or 15 pages every week. You submit it to your writing, the workshop leader who shares it with 3 or 4 other writers in your group. It's the same group that you're with over an extended period of time. Everybody comments on each other's writing and then he comments, and you kind of adjust your writing or you may change perspective or take a different approach or what have you based upon that feedback. Well, there were times where it was just hard to get anything on paper. I don't know how, I didn't know how to get beyond the writer's block, and it was very difficult. And then sometimes it just kind of flowed. Well,
mm,
chapter 17 was one of those chapters that just kind of flowed. And it really did feel like this almost spiritual experience because the chapter itself is capturing a moment in my grandmother's life when she's in her room, she's quilting, and she's being very, very reflective about her life. And she's specifically thinking about her husband, who she's lost, my grandfather, who I'm named after, the decision she's made about sending my mother away so that she can hopefully have a better life and go to a better school, thinking about the funeral of her husband, and this idea of her quilting as she's thinking about a funeral, and the radio is playing and it's playing Precious Lord Take My Hand. It all just kind of
mm.
came together and just kind of really flowed through me. And so that particular chapter is very emotional for me. I mean, sometimes I read, I do readings as part of book events or what have you.
Right.
That particular chapter, even though I've read it a tons of times, I hear it. There's something about saying it out loud that makes it like almost the first time I'm experiencing it.
Wow. And so I'm sure you read it in such a way that the audience really gets it as well. Because I mean that's pretty moving. And thank you for the whole workshop. I always wanted to know how those work. By the
Sure,
way, because I'm like, what's a writer's workshop? That's like what they tell you how to write.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool. And so you in the book, it's clear that your grandmother's a hero, and you explore that heroism rather than focusing on a famous character. So why did you feel you wanted to take that slant as opposed to focusing on something else to write about?
Sure. Well, so it's funny. I still sometimes struggle with calling myself a writer because I had not planned to write a book. As a matter of fact, shortly after my grandmother died, and I had this whole stack of letters from her, my wife had said to me, you should write a book. And this is after we'd learned, some details of my grandmother's life. And I said, Juliet, I'm not writing a book. And this went on for years. And partly because, I love good writing. I love great books. And I just didn't see myself in that vein. I didn't see myself as somebody who could write something that would be that moving or important or special. And I didn't want to write something that was just, frankly, to be a piece of crap. And so I was resistant. But over time, as I came to appreciate my grandmother's story, I thought, you know what? I really want to honor what she has done. And I didn't start out with this idea of celebrating an everyday hero. It was just this person was important to me. I appreciated the sacrifices that she made. I appreciated the ripple effects of that decision she made to send my mother away and how that impacted our family. And so I wanted to chronicle that, even if it was just for me and my children and our family. And in the process, I came to also understand that there are tons of people. I think every single person has someone in their family who makes a pivotal decision or who impacts that family in a very significant way. And oftentimes we just take it for granted. We don't acknowledge it. And particularly at this time in our history, at this time as we see what's happening in current events, this almost assault on Black history, I think it's so important to not only celebrate those people who are heroes and that we know made huge contributions to society, but to also celebrate those people who are doing everyday heroic things just for their little circle of people, who help those people continue to move forward and to make progress and to advance. And so it's what I hope I do in the process is inspire people to pause and think about their own families and to think about those stories that are critical to their family's life and trajectory. And if nothing else, either jot them down or talk about them to families so that our children know where they come from, our families have an appreciation for the foundation, and that they guard and celebrate that history. We don't leave that to others, to the school system or the federal government or other historians. We can do that for ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. I actually saw a story today about Wilmington, North Carolina, which was quite fascinating on how it was a mixed town or biracial town, and then it got totally moved the Black people out of there. It was pretty devastating to hear about, but also very interesting that it even existed. So, kind of when it came to, kind of the research, were there any, I guess, family members that you spoke with that were surprised or maybe, tried to circumvent that the history was true?
So I did speak to family members to get their feedback and to kind of corroborate stories that I had heard. So the work itself is it's a memoir, but also kind of creative nonfiction, because I take events that I know happen in our family's life, and then I have to create scenes around those to bring them to life. So while I know that my grandmother was abused by the aunt and uncle who she lived with for a period of time, I don't have, you know, factual elements or evidence
Mm.
of the conversation. So I had to create those scenes to help illustrate what that was like.
Oh, I see.
But I did not have anyone in the family who was hesitant or reserved about sharing information if they knew it. One of my cousins had done a lot of history on the Hatch side of our family. And so she was able to give me a lot of detail that I did not know and I wasn't aware of.
Mm.
I even oftentimes I would talk to my mom, and I think the idea of being interviewed was rather intimidating for my mother. So if I talked to my mother and she thought I was interviewing her for the book, it would cause her to clam up and she couldn't remember anything.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I got to the point where I stopped doing it from the perspective of, let me interview about the book. I just say, hey, do you remember when Mama Seal used to make this particular dish and why she used to do this? And we'd get into a conversation. And instead of taking notes, I'm just listening really, really carefully so that I can capture it later. And when we're having those conversations, I could get a lot more out of her. The other interesting piece is there was so much about my mother's experience with her mother, my grandmother,
Yeah.
that we had just never talked about. And writing the book gave me a bridge or an avenue for exploring a lot that we had never talked about, even things in my mother's life that I had not known. And so it was a really wonderful experience to be able to explore the aspects of, you know, my grandmother's life, but also my mother's life that I had not known before.
And I'm thank you for telling me that. And so did that open your eyes with how maybe she treated you, or how you were raised as because you had a sister, correct? Is that
That's
correct? Yeah.
right.
So
That's right. I have a sister.
did that open your eyes at all?
You know, it did in a lot of ways, because so the book explores the decision that my grandmother made to send my mother to live with relatives so she could go to a much better school with the hope that she could go to college. And that decision was very difficult for my grandmother. I mean, my grandmother and grandfather had been married for 5 or 6 years before they had my mother, which means that my grandmother had either had difficulty getting pregnant or she had lost pregnancies, because that wasn't a
Mm,
time when people were planning their pregnancies,
right.
right? And so to have a child that they had wanted for years and years and years, and then get to the point to recognize that if I really want to do right by my child, I have to send her away in order to give her a better life. That's, you know, it's heartbreaking to imagine her having to make that decision.
Mm,
The decision itself created a tension, an understandable tension between my mother and my grandmother. My mother always felt given away. My grandmother always worried that my mother loved the family member she was sent to live with more than she loved her. And so, and that was something that I could witness. I could witness the tension, even though I know that they both loved each other dearly, and I witnessed their love for each other. I also witnessed the tension. And there were aspects of, I guess, the way that my mother parented me that I could tie to how her experience impacted her with her mother. And I think there are ways that I parent my children, either to emulate or to not emulate what I experienced. And so I think there is a through line from my grandmother's experiences to my mother to mine in terms of either generational trauma or benefit or what have you. There's definitely a connection.
gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Um, so I guess you write also beautifully about generational progress and sacrifice. So one question I have: do you consider yourself your grandmother's, I guess, wildest dream?
You know, it's in some respects, I guess I probably do. And it's funny because that came up in one of our writing workshops, and we were talking about just, I don't know, something I had done or something my kids were doing. And I think it was my workshop leader that, you realize you must be your grandmother's wildest dream, which started me to write one of the essays in the book that, it's generally, the book is structured as a narrative of my grandmother's life. And it's punctuated with these various essays that kind of create a more direct conversation between her life and my life. And so my grandmother, her goal, her dream was for her daughter to graduate from college. I don't even know if she thought beyond the point of what might happen when her daughter graduated from college and how that would impact her grandchildren or her great grandchildren. But I'm so grateful that my grandmother lived to not only see her daughter graduate, she saw me graduate from college, my sister graduate from college, my sister graduate from graduate school, me graduate from law school. And I don't know that any of us at the time tied that back to the decision that she made to sacrifice her relationship with her child so that her daughter could go to college. But it absolutely is the starting point and that pivotal moment that changed everything going forward.
Okay. One thing and it might be in there, if it is, forgive me. But did you write back?
So I did occasionally write back. I don't know that it explicitly talks about that in the book, but for example, there's one of her letters where I think she says, "Thank you for my letter," or "Thank you for my birthday card." And so when I was really little, and when my sister and I were little, my mother would sometimes say, "Okay, you're going to write your grandmother, so let's go sit down." And we'd sit down and, in our little, first grade, second grade paper, write out little letters and send them to her. And at one point, we had actually discovered some of the letters that she had saved. And unfortunately, those were kind of lost over the years. But we did occasionally write to her. And even as an adult, I would try to carve out time. I was not great at it. I certainly was not as good as she was at sitting down to having the discipline to write regularly. But I always was repaid, many times over when I sent her a letter, because she was always so grateful and happy to get them.
Okay. And I'll have another question about letter writing at the end, but I just wanted to ask if it was a reciprocal thing. That
somewhat. I mean, obviously when my mother was saying, "Okay, we're going to write her," of course we sat down and do it. And then of course you get to junior high school or high school and there's activities and there's other stuff and you find all kinds of things to do other than that. But
you're like, "Okay, Ma, I'll get to it."
Right. Eventually.
I'll get to it.
Exactly.
I'll get to it. So the book highlights, of course, the strength of Black women. It was very evident in the book. So what did your memoir and writing it teach you about the often unrecognized contribution of Black mothers and grandmothers?
It's interesting that you asked that question at this point in time, because, again, we're seeing this kind of shift to a place of intolerance in society and a shift towards racial intolerance and racial tension. And the anchor in so many of our families has always been Black women, who are at the lowest point on the totem pole, if you're considering, the hierarchy of society, but who carry the greatest weight in really, solidifying and providing a foundation for Black families. And I don't know that it was revelatory for me, more so than it was just to see an example in my own family, in my own grandmother, the dynamic that we see across time, across history, and the role that she played in shaping the future for our family in the same way that so many Black women do and continue to do for their family. And even in this moment, when you look at the strength of Black women in terms of how they're showing up politically, how they're showing up socially, how they are an example of resilience, it's a really timely lesson. And I'm glad that my book touches upon that. I had no sense of when the book would actually come out or if it would even be published, but I'm really glad that it helps focus our attention on the role of Black women, because I think it continues to be undersung even as we are acknowledging it more.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, we are we're very strange times in our, kind of country. And I think especially for our younger people need to lean more on their mothers and grandmothers' stories in
Mhm.
order to get a true sense of really what happened in the past, and which they can use for the future. Because I think the history that we tend to know or talk about is being kind of wiped away.
Mhm. Mhm. I
So
completely agree.
yeah.
And I found that it's in addition to those particular historical things that we learn from it, it also teaches us lessons in resilience, right? My grandmother did not have a model for sending a child to college. She just knew that's what she wanted. And at the time, I don't think she knew anybody in our family. I don't think we had anybody in our family
Mm,
who had gone to college. Now, by the time my mother graduated high school and was going, there were other people in our family who had gone to college. But at the point that she made the decision to say, I'm sending this child to live with this sister cousin so that she can go to a great school, she didn't have that model. And she's living at a time, mind you, she's born in 1915. So it's Jim Crow, Arkansas. It is the height of, discrimination, segregation, threat to the very existence. And yet she has the audacity to dream and want to make this happen. And so she does it. And she didn't have, a civil rights movement at the time to look to. She didn't have the election of a Barack Obama to look to. And so a lot of what she was able to do, it was based upon her belief, her faith, her resilience to withstand what was happening around her. And so the lesson I think for us now is a lot of our young people are very disillusioned by what's happening in society, but they do have the history of a civil rights movement. They do have an election of Barack Obama. So my hope is that, you know, things were so much worse for my grandmother, and yet she was able to maintain a level of faith and hope and resilience. And so I hope that that bears out as a lesson for young people that even as things are better now, and they seem to be getting worse, there's still a lot of reason to be hopeful and faithful and to
mm.
expect more better things to come.
Right, but one thing which is why your book is so beautiful, we don't really have hear stories of everyday people doing
Hmm.
extraordinary things. And because just the way our society is, those figures, they seem like larger than life figures,
Hmm.
because we don't necessarily hear about the struggles of how they got to where they were, unless we read their biography
Sure.
or things of that nature, because of our short attention spans, we just get the quick and dirty stories of how they
Yeah.
got to where they were, and not necessarily the small, I guess, the small victories of working within their
Hmm.
towns or local governments and things of that nature. So that's why I think your book resonates very deeply.
Well, thank you for that.
Um, so I guess in today's climate, and we just kind of touched upon it, but I want to make sure if there's nothing else. What do you want readers of all backgrounds to gain from your family story?
What I really hope is that people pause and look to their own family histories and consider who are those sheroes and heroes in their family's life who they should be acknowledging, who they should be celebrating, who they should be teaching to their children. Because I do believe that there is someone in every family, and sometimes several people in every family who make these really amazing decisions or who are able to withstand significant obstacles and traumas to contribute to the family's progress moving forward. And so maybe people will write a book. I don't know, but I hope that they will at least somehow acknowledge and pay tribute to their family members who've helped them to be where they are today. And I think that crosses race, it crosses status, it crosses ethnic origin, it crosses gender, it crosses all of those things that might divide us and separate us. I think we all recognize that you know we don't get to where we are by ourselves. We stand on the shoulders of others. And so acknowledging that, I think, is really important. And that's what I hope I inspire people to do.
Great, great. And I think what you said earlier, that your grandmother would write to your wife. Is that right?
Well, she did. She wrote to my wife. She met my wife before we were married. And so she wrote her, but she also wrote our daughter. And actually, the last letter that we got from her was 2 months before she died. And it was wishing our daughter a happy birthday.
Oh, okay. And how did your wife feel about the letters that she received?
Oh, my wife loved them. My wife really loved the letters. She loved being able to meet my grandmother. My grandmother absolutely adored my wife. And so that's one of the wonderful things about the experience that I had a chance to kind of revisit and think about. One of her letters that's included in the book, after she first met Juliet, she wrote something like, "Please tell the girlfriend hello." And then she wrote, "I didn't want to spell her name because I thought I would get it wrong." But then letters later, she's spelling her name correctly and asking about her and telling her, teaming up with her against me. So my grandmother actually got a chance to meet my daughter. Unfortunately, she died before our son was born. And so I really hate that they never got to know each other. But I do really cherish the fact that my wife had a relationship with my grandmother as well.
Yes. And then in all the letters that you do have, is there one that you particularly go back to?
Not necessarily. In writing the book, let me back up. Of the 1,000 letters that she wrote me, I have about 57. And 14 of those are recreated or represented in the book.
Okay.
And when you look at the letters, again, there's not like some sage wisdom or some huge lesson. Generally, she's just letting me know how she's doing. She, the advice that she gives me is to pray and be a good boy, and tells me that she loves me. And then, there may be other things that she asks me to do or to tell someone else hello or what she's experiencing. But again, it wasn't so much what was in the letter as it was the letter itself and the act of writing it and sending it and making sure that I received it so that I understood she was thinking of me and she was loving me.
Now I'm going to put you on the spot.
Okay.
If you were tasked to write a letter, ongoing letter to someone, and you decided, either for the next year or, at least as a starter, you're gonna commit to writing someone, who would that person be and why?
I think, it would be two people, and it would be my children. And I realized in this process that as much as I think I'm a great communicator, I'm not. And I realized I don't convey the pride I have in my children as much as I think I do. I don't tell them as much what a great job they're doing or what great people I think they are or how much I like them. It's funny. I tell people, you have to love your children because they're your children. You don't necessarily have to like them.
Right.
You hope you like them. I really like my children, and I feel like, and I like the people that they are. I like how they challenge me to be a better person, in the way that I probably didn't have the courage to do with my own parents. And so I would write to both of them with the hopes of communicating better, but also inspiring them to do even more than they're doing.
Oh, wow. And do you think since you mentioned that, because we all have phones and I'm sure they have, you can text them and the whole bit and tell them that, but do you find that writing a letter would make it easier to convey those things or the same?
That's a great question. And I'm not sure of the answer. I think in some ways, the distance and being able to put it on paper may make you bolder in some ways. But I also think all the competing demands that we live under, sitting down and write a letter becomes also very challenging. And so I think I tend to lean towards the fact that there's something tangible about having a letter in your hand That's different from getting a text. That's different from getting a phone call. And I'm starting to appreciate even more the value of an actual letter. And so the fact that you asked the question and the fact that I've been thinking about it more is probably motivating me to start writing letters.
Oh,
And I
there you
don't know if
go.
I'm going
There
to
you
get to a
go.
weekly letter the way that my grandmother did.
Uh-huh.
But I do think that there is something really special about having a letter to hold in your hand and to look back on at some point later, whether the person's still around or not. So I would absolutely write my children. And I think maybe God gave you that message to motivate me to start doing it sooner rather than later.
Okay. I love it. I love it. And I hadn't thought about it. I haven't thought about it myself, but yeah, it's just something to think about, especially the communication piece, because I just do think the phone doesn't lend itself to be thoughtful because it's really about being quick. And so
Right.
things can kind of get lost in translation. So I do have the book right here. This leaves me at okay. Authors Walter Pryor. Please pick it up. It's a fantastic book. And Walter, I just thank you for taking the time today, and then also really for sharing your grandmother and your mother and your story with us.
Well, Keith, I really appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here to share with your listeners, and I appreciate the thoughtful way that you both read the book and asked me about it. It's been a really delightful conversation.
Great. Hold on a second as we close. So thank you, folks, for that message, because I think it's our families, no matter what they have done, can have a legacy that they can share with us. But it's our responsibility to get those messages. So, hey, what better way than to write your parents or grandparents a letter, and they'll probably write back. So this is Keith M for the Black Men Speak podcast. Peace.